Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our panel today. I want to thank the Wilson Center and the Asia program at the Wilson Center for hosting this event, and for our panelists here for contributing to the discussion of the services sector role in boosting U.S. competitiveness. And our hope, really, when you get right down to it, is that through this panel and the continuing discussion that we hope that it will spark, is we're trying to explain how the issue should not be services versus manufacturing, as it's often discussed in academic articles and in the press, but it's services and manufacturing. And what we hope to explain to you this morning, and in the paper that Sherry Stevenson has done, and in the anecdotes that panelists will give you from each of their industry experiences, is that services is very much integrated with manufacturing. And in fact, services is key to the competitiveness of manufacturing. It's responsible for making manufacturing more profitable. It's responsible for making it more competitive in world markets. And it's responsible in many instances, again, as you will hear this morning, in really producing and promoting more manufacturing exports throughout the world. So that's really our goal, and the discussion we hope to engage in with all of you after you hear our panelists' presentations this morning. I also want to particularly thank Paul Thanos, who worked with us while he was a fellow at the Wilson Center. He's now back at the Department of Commerce. But it was really a very insightful article that he wrote now a little more than a year ago about the role of services in the U.S. economy, in which he really pointed to the relationship between services and manufacturing. And it really inspired us and made us think that this was an area that we should focus on, particularly because for this administration, we understand there is a great focus and interest in promoting the manufacturing sector. So, with that in mind, we also are very pleased to have with us this morning two of our Coalition of Services Industries members, Mastercard and Microsoft. The Coalition of Services Industries represents a wide spectrum of the U.S. services sector, from the IT sector, communications, financial services, professional services, distribution and logistics, media and entertainment. And from that wide perspective, one of our major goals is explaining the role of services in the U.S. economy, and how, in fact, the services sector is a huge job creator, particularly in the business services sector, which is what we really focus on for trade purposes, which on average has even higher wages in many instances than the manufacturing sector. We are also very pleased this morning that Dr. Trevor Gunn from Medtronic, a medical equipment and services company, is joining us on our panel. Also, Sherry Stevenson from the ICTSD, and of course our moderator, Meg Lunsager. I think I've given you a sense of what the Coalition of Services Industries is all about. But let me talk just for a second about why services are important. U.S. services exports and investment support, as of 2015, almost 10 million jobs. And I think that's a little understood fact. Frequently, people just think about exports, but they don't think about the investment component, which is critically important and a draw for U.S. exports, and also an area that supports U.S. employment. There's a lot of talk, as all of you know these days, about trade deficits, but services are consistently generating a trade surplus for the United States. And as I explained, and you will hear this morning, services are also supporting manufacturing exports and making them more innovative and competitive. America is first in services, and we want to keep it that way. And we often say that you can't grow it, build it, move it, buy it, or sell it without services. And a very key part of this is that the U.S. is also a leader in digital services and digitally enabled services, which are transforming every aspect of the American economy and allowing businesses of all sizes to sell products all over the world. Just to give you an idea of the volume of this, in 2015, digitally enabled services accounted for $159 billion of the U.S. $262 billion services trade surplus. So the impact is huge. And digitally enabled services are critical to manufacturing. Again, as you will hear this morning, from cloud services to specific services like Mastercard that are embedded now in manufactured goods. And again, an interesting fact that you will hear this morning, I don't think you generally associate the names of Mastercard and GM together, but in fact, they are partners that are actively working together. Just another illustration of the close relationship between services and manufacturing. So today we're here to talk about the building it part of the story and how the companies represented here today integrate their services into manufacturing, which makes manufacturing so competitive and successful world over. And if you or your company or your organization are interested in the Coalition of Services in Industries and our activities, please find me after the event, and I'm happy to give you more information. And with that, let me turn things over to our moderator, Meg Lunsager. Thank you, Meg.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. That was very helpful to get this overview of services and manufacturing in the U.S. economy. And I, too, would like to thank Paul Thanos for the work he did when he was here at the Wilson Center. What I'd like to do today is ask Sherry Stevenson to start off giving us a bit of a picture of how this interrelationship has developed and deepened and become very, very important, as Christine was just describing, over time. And then I'll turn to each one of our panelists, and you do have detailed bios in the handout that was outside the entrance. And then we'll have a discussion here. After a bit, then I will open it to questions for the floor. So, Sherry, let me turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meg. I'm very pleased to be here on behalf of the ICTSD, which is a think tank based in Geneva focusing on trade and sustainable development, and which is also the publisher of the Bridges newsletter, which basically reaches all the corners of the earth to inform people about developments in international trade. I'd also like to thank CSI for sponsoring these background papers. Thank you so much. And both CSI and the Wilson Center for organizing this event. So we're going to discuss the relationship between services and manufacturing. And I think that we can start by saying traditionally, as Christine mentioned, these have been considered separately. But in fact, this really does not correspond to our current reality. Traditionally, manufacturing has been thought of in terms of the physical output of consumer capital goods, equipment, and machinery. But this image needs to change because it has changed. As we realize the growing role that services plays in each stage of the manufacturing process, services have become the hidden drivers of productivity, innovation, and competitiveness as they enable U.S. manufacturers to be more profitable, more innovative, and export on global markets. Let's put our topic into a bit of context before we begin. For quite a while, services have been the lion's share of the U.S. economy. Services industries employ around 75% of the American workforce and contribute to 80% of U.S. GDP. The business services sector employs twice as many workers as manufacturing and pays them about 20% more than the average manufacturing wage. The wage gap is even higher for services jobs that are oriented towards exports. Services exports are the most dynamic component, as Christine mentioned, of U.S. trade, and they generate consistent surpluses. So keep this context in mind as we turn to the relationship between services and manufacturing. I'd like to make 5 main points and support these with examples. The first one, the distinction between manufacturers and services is becoming increasingly blurred and sometimes indistinguishable. Manufacturing is relying increasingly on services, which are used all throughout the length of the production process, from the beginning of the supply chain, throughout the process, and all the way to the end and the after-sales activities. Services that are bundled with goods, manufactured goods, contribute to the final value of the product. These can either be what we call embedded or included into the production process along the way. And in this, think of energy, transport, communications, insurance, accountancy, consulting, design, advertising, marketing, warehousing, software, legal, and other professional services, and I could go on. Or services can be embodied or embedded at the point of sale of the manufactured product, so embedded. And think in this context of financing, training, maintenance, and after-sales services, amongst others, which you purchase when you purchase a product. The term servicification has even been coined, I don't know if it's entered the dictionary yet or not, but have a look for it, as and defined as the increasing use of services by manufacturing firms in their purchases and production and exports. And this is reflecting the integrated role and growing role that services play throughout the production process. Up to 60% of employment in manufacturing firms is now found in services support functions. Think engineering, research and development, transport, marketing, IT, logistics, and back office support. And these continue to grow. Point number 2, services are the hidden elements that make manufacturing more competitive, both domestically and on international markets. Many studies have shown that the more competitive the services inputs going into manufacturing, the more competitive is the final product. Over 50%, for example, of the cost now of an average car produced on the American market is derived from services. For electronics, this percentage can be even higher. This is the case for the Apple iPod and iPad, where more than half of the value is actually composed of services. In the US, many traditional manufacturing firms are moving into a greater number of services activities. Some have even begun to focus exclusively on services and do not call themselves manufacturing firms at all. Think of IBM, a major multinational that has reinvented itself and has moved from producing hardware to ideation, another new word coined. IBM describes itself on its website as an American multinational technology company. If you scroll down its list of products, you can find the following: analytics, cloud, the Internet of Things, mobile, security, health, and of course, Watson. Boeing has said that it would like to be viewed as a services company. Who would think that? Given that services are by far the most important part of its operations. Boeing uses computerized design and digital processes at every stage of the production and manufacturing phase, with the data requirements huge in order to combine and assemble more than 5 million parts that are involved in building each airplane and the 65 million parts that go through its factories every month. Third point, services are essential to improve the profitability of manufacturing firms. Without services, no profit. Services have enabled manufacturers to become more competitive as the result of the application of cutting-edge technologies. A recent study by Deloitte of 80 multinational manufacturing companies from all sectors showed that services constituted as much as 46% of their profits, but only 25% of their revenues, so nearly half of their profits derived from their services activities. The average profitability of the service businesses that were involved in these manufacturing companies surveyed was shown to be more than 75% higher than the overall business unit profitability. I read a recent article that for Apple in 2016, 1/3 of the company's profits came from services, not what they call it hardware, which I call it actually an electronic product, but not even the iPhone, the iPad, and so forth, but pure services applications such as App Store purchases, Apple Music, and iCloud storage, amongst others. And Apple was described as moving from only iPhones matter to iPhones and services matter. In fact, the Deloitte study concluded that for many manufacturing companies today, there would be little or no profitability without their service business. Point 4, the percentage of services that is bundled in traded manufacturing products is growing around the world, for the United States as well. And if you calculate this on a value-added basis, services now represent fully 1/2 of world trade. The OECD and the WTO have produced recently a new database called Trade and Value Added that allow us to identify and measure the value of services that are inputted into manufacturing production and final merchandise goods. When these are all added up, we now know, and you can find this database available publicly, that services represent over 1/2 of world trade. This is true as well for the United States. When taking into account the value of the numerous services embodied in the production of U.S. goods, services represented 50% of U.S. exports already in 2013. Point 5, services and data flows to produce smart products are already here, and they are definitely the way of the future in manufacturing. The 4th industrial revolution is upon us, with the emergence of the digital economy and data flows. Digital services provide 25% of the total input of manufacturing, empowering improvements in efficiency through smart technologies. Manufacturing firms are putting major investments, as we're going to hear, into the in-house services and data components of their businesses in order to increase their digital footprint. Smart products are now appearing everywhere. From phones to cars, think Tesla and other self-driving models, to health products, to sporting equipment. You may soon be playing with a smart tennis racket. These are all empowered by services. The way of the future for manufacturing firms is to become integrated services providers and move into smart manufacturing. The shift in the manufacturing paradigm will continue as we increasingly develop smart products through integrating high-tech and high-quality services. So in conclusion, what are our 2 takeaways from this broad overview? First, the distinction between manufacturing and services has become very blurred and will become even less distinct in the future. Firms have moved, manufacturing firms, and are increasingly moving into an integrated system of production involving often as many services as physical inputs to produce a final product, sometimes more, and all combined and supported by data and technology. Second takeaway, we need to update our thinking and embrace an expanded vision of what we talk about and what we think about when we discuss the manufacturing sector. Policy needs to understand and support the contribution of services in this regard in order to revitalize what already is and will continue to be a transformed and integrated world of manufacturing output, manufacturing/services output. Thank you very much.
Sherry, thank you very much. That was terrific, just highlighting all the aspects of why this interlinkage is so important to the U.S. economy, and I think really overlooked in the policy realm. And this is what I worry about. I mean, 20 years ago, I was negotiating services agreements when I was at Treasury, and it was very difficult even then to get the big picture put together, especially when you were negotiating with other countries who had more of a tendency to segment, right, in terms of different negotiations. What I'd like to do now is turn to our panelists, ask each of them a question to give us a sense of how their firm, their industry, really serves as a very good example of what Sherry was describing to us. So let me turn first to Matthew. So here you are, Microsoft, very busy with the cloud. And the cloud, what is the cloud? Something up in the sky? No, it's servers, right, at different parts of the country. But can you tell us a little bit about how Microsoft and the services it's providing through the cloud, through that technology, is enhancing exactly what Sherry was talking about, the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturing?
Absolutely. So first, Sherry, thank you so much. That was, I thought, a terrific summary. But maybe I could just bring a little bit of color to the phenomena that Sherry was talking about with some examples from our business. Let me say that it's not just Microsoft. There's a world of transformation happening. Working for Microsoft, those are the examples that I know best, so that I'll share with you. I think one really interesting trend is something that we call predictive analytics, which is exactly what it sounds like. So using services provided by companies like Microsoft, manufacturers are able to harness the power of the cloud, harness the power of data to spot problems before they occur, which has huge benefits for those manufacturers and their customers. I really liked, Sherry, you used sort of a framework that I think is really relevant for what we're doing. You talked about services being embedded either in the production process or at the point of sale. And what we're having happen is really a revolution in both of those. So, for example, we work with one of the world's largest manufacturers of aircraft engines, to take an example. Now, 15 years ago, if you looked at an aircraft engine, there were hardly any sensors in them. They were magnificent pieces of machinery, but you might not call them smart. We're in a different world today. So now an aircraft engine is loaded with sensors, and each of those sensors is generating a huge amount of data. So what's happening is we're helping our customer take advantage of that data, to harness it, to just not only store it, but to understand it, and then to generate actionable insights. So, for example, this manufacturer works with their customers, the airlines, to work in real time to see problems with all the thousands and thousands of components in the engine and to anticipate them and address those problems before there are failures, which obviously can have a business cost, but very clearly a human cost. But beyond the maintenance issue, they're also helping them make the world better through reducing emissions and helping on climate issues, in the sense that we are able to understand better than ever before how to optimize fuel efficiency and to burn less fuel in an engine, because we can help our we can help the manufacturer to help their customers look at things like flight plans and how those relate to fuel use, maintenance schedules, and even the weather. So the revolution here is really twofold. There's upstream, using our cloud services throughout their manufacturing process, but then downstream at that point of sale, this manufacturer is able to offer more valuable services than ever before. So I've got countless other examples, but I think they all kind of get at the same phenomenon, from oil and gas equipment suppliers to elevator controls. We see the same revolution in terms of the manufacturing process and the services that manufacturers can provide.
Matthew, that's a really great example, because a lot of that is invisible to us as, final consumers, whether we're flying on an airplane or riding in an elevator, and yet, we really do count on the safety, the reliability of what we're doing, and so anything that can enhance that and increases efficiency is very much welcome. Sarah, I wanted to ask you about Mastercard and the work it does. I mean, we all know as consumers, we have our credit cards. Tell us a bit about how Mastercard helps manufacturing, a bit beyond that final consumer product that we're all familiar with.
Sure, and first I'll start off by saying Mastercard is not a credit card company. We are a technology company. We actually move bits of data back and forth across borders, and we rely on data flows every day in the 210 countries we do business. The banks are actually our customers. But I think we're actually looking, and you've pointed out sort of the lines blurring. We see that in our business in what we call IoT, which is the Internet of Things. And if you think about it, it's just seamlessly connecting a device across the global internet or across a network. And we estimate by 2020 there'll be 30 billion units of connected devices. And if you think about it, every connected device could become a commerce device. And that's why we're sort of investing in technology that allows us to embed our services in these connected devices. And the most simple example is your iPhone. You can pay for things now using Apple Pay. You can pay with your Mastercard. But I think more interesting one is where Christine mentioned it. We're working with GM, and you don't always think about Mastercard and GM. But what we've done this year is we've started to embed our digital wallet into the OnStar system in GM cars. So you can think about you're driving and you want to order your Starbucks coffee ahead of time, or you want to find a parking spot. We can send offers through the OnStar system, and you can pay for things through that system. So that's kind of what we're working on with GM, as well as the key fob. So think of your key fob as a wallet now. Another great example that I think most of us can probably realistically kind of think about your smart fridge. So we're actually working with Samsung on one of their latest models in their smart fridges, where you can actually, you can put things in your cart on your touch screen on the refrigerator and pay for your groceries and get it delivered by Fresh Direct. So these are just a couple of examples of how we're sort of integrating our services into traditional manufacturing products.
So it ends up being then that coming back to Sherry's introduction, it is embedded in the product then, right? The service. Right. And so it's not just the work of putting it in there to begin with, but it's the ongoing making sure it works and the companies get the data, the consumer's happy. So there's that ongoing linkage, that ongoing interaction between the manufactured product and the service. Trevor, I wanted to ask you about Medtronic. I mean, most of us think of Medtronic as a manufacturer of medical devices, but those medical devices are not something you go and buy in the drugstore. They're something that your doctor works with you. And so, of course, there's got to be ongoing, let's say, services related to that to make sure that the device works, that the doctor gets the data, that the consumer, the patient can continue to benefit from it. Can you tell us a little bit about how all that works for Medtronic?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks to Christy and you, Meg and Sherry also for bringing us all together. I'm probably not the brand name that my colleagues to my left and my right are. So maybe just to give us an idea of the footprint, we are the largest medical technology manufacturer with producing about 168,000 SKUs right now in 92 manufacturing facilities and about $30 billion in revenue. But I think that I won't be talking really that much about that, but how does excuse the expression, very advanced widget A, how is it developed with traditional service? I'll be talking about traditional service, I'll talk about new services. So bear with us because we're literally at the juncture here of particularly in the healthcare area, some interesting and exciting developments. So look, I'll be the first guy to say that I didn't understand. If I don't see things, I can't touch them, I sometimes don't think that they exist. So I figured I'd bring a pacemaker. So this is a pacemaker. We are the inventor of the pacemaker. Wow. This is a pacemaker, 9,764 components, tons and tons of software. It talks to the network. People can, if you enable it, your cardiologist, and no matter where it is in the world, can actually watch your heartbeat in real time. Okay, and so that's literally until 9 months ago, very quickly, and I'll talk about these services processes in a second. This as of, thanks Matt, takes a technology company. Okay, appreciate it. So about 9 months ago, we received approval for this one, which looks, literally it is the size of a pill. It's first in the market. This is a new pacemaker, okay? I'm happy to show them around. But just so you understand what goes into some of these devices, let's be completely honest that what we do in our company and most medical technology companies can be extremely, extremely dangerous if it's not made to the highest possible quality. And it starts with training and education of doctors, because to be completely frank with you, if we don't have great nurses, doctors, well-trained, and have ongoing education and training, this is a great paperweight, literally. It will go nowhere. It will not save any lives. It will not do anything. So education and training is really at the heart of it. Being that we're probably the most regulated industry, arguably right up near commercial aircraft, probably right up there, and you want it that way. These things are going into your body, literally, probably for the rest of your lives. That's exactly the way you want it. You can imagine all the regulatory processes that go into the clinical trials, the amount of statisticians, the epidemiologists, the doctors, the institutions globally that enable this actual process to take place. I also think about the supply chain companies. I happened to take the midnight tour out at FedEx, and we use both FedEx and UPS. And if you've ever been out to FedEx in Memphis, Tennessee, you can look over all the packages that are going in. I see Amazon, Medtronic, Amazon, Medtronic. So we have a massive actually four, literally right on the FedEx runway in Memphis, because we can ship these type of things around the world literally overnight. And so I certainly point to that as well. I want to come back to the issue of suppliers, because people do use, and Matt, it was a great example to talk about Boeing. Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, and Bombardier, as four major actors in commercial aviation, have each about 20 to 23,000 suppliers. We have 130,000 suppliers. So just because they're big and they fly, you can imagine the complexity that goes into qualifying those suppliers, all the services that goes in. I said, this tiny little thing that you can literally hold in the palm of your hand has 9,764 components in it. That tells you about the complexity, but at the end of the day, if you didn't have these services, there would be no perfection in manufacturing, there would be no lives saved, or there would be, let's say, at best, the job would be left half done, and particularly in our area, that's not job good enough. Thank you.
Wow, that was really useful, Trevor. Thank you. And reassuring, let me say, to those of us and to others who may be using these devices. Sherry, I just wanted to come back on one point in terms of, when we think of, I keep coming back to, the overall policy environment, the goals of the administration and Congress, which is to create good paying jobs in the United States. But we also have a lot of job creation by small and medium-sized enterprises, right? And maybe there's some of the many thousands, 100,000 suppliers along the way. But can you tell us a little bit about how the services help generate that expansion, increased efficiency, job creation in the small and medium-sized enterprise area?
Yes, sure, Meg. Thanks very much. We do tend, with such famous and well-known companies and fantastic companies that operate around the globe, we do tend to forget that actually the majority of firms in our economy are small and medium-sized enterprises, and that they actually, some say, form the backbone of the U.S. economy. And so I do think it is relevant and right to bring in this aspect, because small and medium-sized enterprises, which in the U.S. are defined as firms with less than 500 employees, which is already not so small, but that is the definition. So if you use that definition, there are 30 million businesses in the U.S. that are SMEs, and they represent 98% of all U.S. businesses. So that's huge. So we have 2% here, but actually 98% are not present in our discussion, and these are operating, and most of these SMEs are services companies. In fact, 2/3 of these SMEs identify themselves as services companies. And what's important is what Meg said, is that a lot of these SMEs pay more. They create jobs that are better paying because 40% of these SMEs are in high-tech industries. So they pay higher wages. And therefore, they drive innovation, they drive productivity. They produce 16 times more patents per employee than large firms. You have a lot of these facts on the fact sheet that is outside the room, because it's included in one of the 3 short papers that CSI initiated and that form the basis of our discussion today. And the SME paper is a nice complement to our other discussion on services and manufacturing. And the SMEs are now reaching export markets in big ways, in ways they could not do before, and that is thanks to digital platforms, to the use of digital platforms, which have really transformed the possibilities for small companies to reach out into all corners of the globe. 96% of customers are outside, global customers are outside U.S. markets. And SMEs are on the same level playing ground as big multinationals to reach these customers by using digital platforms. So when you think of it, nearly 98% of the U.S. companies that exported in 2013 were SMEs, and they generated 1/3 of the total value of U.S. exports. So yes, there's a huge opportunities here for SMEs. The majority of SMEs are services companies. They pay higher wages on average, and they generate more jobs, and they are connecting increasingly to the global market. And services is a very big part of the success story. But there's a lot more to be done, so I can't just stop there. A lot more to be done, a lot more opportunities to be exploited for SMEs, and part of that we can discuss later. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. I wanted to ask each one of our panelists to talk a little bit about the policy aspects that are important so that the broader U.S. economy can benefit from these benefits, these interlinkages. So in part, can you tell us, each one of you, a bit about how, you've all described different aspects for how you engage internationally, cross-border. But what are the kind of policy approaches that you need when you're looking to be able to compete internationally? For small and medium-sized enterprises, for example, they're not going to have the, let's say, the personnel in a front office or necessarily a local office that might know what local conditions are and be better placed to try and figure out how to do that. What are the kinds of policy approaches the U.S. government should be taking? What are the kinds of policies that U.S. negotiators, U.S. policymakers should be looking at in terms of trying to negotiate to keep or to enhance a level playing field for U.S. Services providers? Sarah, why don't I start with you, and you give me, if you can give us some idea of what Mastercard, in terms of what you were describing, the cross-border activity of your technology company, what's important for them?
Sure, and I would just add, maybe I'll touch upon that later, but Mastercard, like Microsoft and like UPS and others, are actually global companies, but we help support small businesses on our platforms. If you think about it, they can't rely on the Mastercard cloud or our payment services to export. They need them. But in terms of U.S. trade policy, I think, like I said before, we rely on data flows. That is our business. We are sending bits of data back and forth. And our infrastructure and our technology and our workers are actually here in the U.S. So in order to leverage that U.S. workforce and our technology, we really need open markets across the world. And so does the digital economy. If you think about what I spoke about with this IoT, it's the same thing. It's data flows going back and forth. So I would ask, I would think U.S. trade policy should make that sort of a number one concern in terms of having free flow of data. And also, we've seen increasingly, so, if you think about the world and where we export and where we're seeing the most growth, we're actually seeing the most growth in Asia. About 40% of our revenue comes from Asia today. But increasingly, we're actually seeing a lot of more protectionist barriers popping up in Asia, from China to Vietnam to Indonesia. I mean, the list goes on, and every day there's something new. And it's in the form of sort of these, domestic regulation, protection of data, or localization of data in different forms. So I would sort of, caution and hope the U.S. government can kind of pay close attention to that, because other countries are paying attention, other regions are paying attention. That's really going to squeeze our business here in order to leverage our infrastructure here in the U.S. I mean, we don't want to replicate in the 210 countries we do business in.
Thank you. That's really interesting that you are looking to use your people here, your technology here, because it's, for what you provide, is so easy to do cross-border. Yet a lot of the, you touched on a point, it's something which I remember from when I was negotiating these, that it's very often that another country uses domestic regulation to limit the access of services providers to the economy, and it's done in a way that's meant to protect, domestic consumers. And so it was one thing to try and negotiate responsible regulation in other countries that would allow competition, right, fair competition. The U.S. firms aren't asking for any advantage over domestic firms, but still to make sure that those domestic regulations were not, in fact, discriminatory against the foreign firms. And I think that's been, as far as I can tell, an ongoing challenge for many, many years to try and address that. But let me turn to you others. Matthew, you want to give us some sense of what your policy priorities might be?
There's a great amount of alignment with the issues that Sarah identified. I mean, Microsoft has historically been a strong supporter of trade agreements, just because in general for business, we all do better when the rules of the road are clear and predictable, and trade agreements have really been an asset in that regard. Going back now a couple of decades, the rules that have been negotiated on services, breaking down barriers to market access, ensuring non-discriminatory treatment are vital for all of us, I think. And one thing I'll note is, as the United States is looking forward at modernizing some trade agreements or perhaps entering new ones, it's important to maintain those old principles, call them the old standbys on discrimination, non-discrimination, MFN, most favored nation treatment, but then looking into these new areas to make binding commitments. We in the United States haven't had a binding commitment in a trade agreement that's entered into force yet on this issue of cross-border data flows. Everything we've been talking about today, none of it works unless data can move across borders. And that's not only important for us, it's these hundreds of thousands of companies that are SMEs, that are our partners, that are our customers around the world who want to access the most innovative services and products. So we are hoping that this issue of binding commitments on data flows will be a cornerstone of future trade agreements.
Thank you. Trevor?
So maybe to explain what we're hoping for in terms of new trade agreements, starting with NAFTA, but certainly we realize that other trade agreements are going to be reevaluated as well. As we've been asking our negotiators to think about how about a transition that's happening in the medical technology industry to a more solutions-based industry could be better protected. And I'll come back to that in a second, but just for you to understand what I mean by solutions, first of all. I mean, I've explained to you already the traditional hardware business and how services envelop those and enable that. But here's a situation where we've made perhaps leading a transition in our industry over the past 3 years, literally, that far back. But others are moving in this direction as well, which is, in essence, aimed at trying to get better healthcare costs, get them better under wraps. We certainly have a big problem in the United States. I don't need to tell you. But the issue is that around the world that's a big problem as well in terms of cost, but also to get better outcomes. What I would just simply say is that we as a company, we're kind of doing an IBM, and Sherry, you mentioned IBM. We're kind of doing an IBM without divesting hardware assets. So it's the and, services and. I mean, we're not going to divest any of our 92 manufacturing facilities other than what we've already publicly disclosed. At the end of the day, value-based healthcare, I mean, healthcare is one of the only sectors in the economy that does not have the type of accountability that almost all other industries do. We've set in motion a process called value-based healthcare, which in essence is as simple as this, according to Michael Porter, which is outcomes is defined that by patients. That could be just less pain. That could be you want to save your life. Whatever the patient would say, over cost. Very simple. That's value-based healthcare. And if you're just producing technology and you don't have services, you don't have greater accountability and responsibility within the context of the healthcare system, you're at a loss because you don't have an integrated way to do it. And that's something I wanted to point out too. Around the world, and particularly in Asia, you have challenges such as aging societies, universal healthcare coverage. We're struggling with those issues in the United States, but Asia's certainly struggling with all those as well. So at the end of the day, how do you get to those populations, be them elderly populations, rural populations, if not by IT, if not by enabling through communications and other technology, transactional support as well, those type of things. And so we've asked USTR, and we've made a formal submission under AdvaMed in terms of the NAFTA renegotiation, that they look at some disciplines in there. And what we're seeing in different markets around the world, Korea is a very good example. It's the only country in the world where we cannot actually offer services in the way that I've just described them to you. We're actually, by the way, side note, we're actually the largest cardiac cath lab operator in the world right now as a company. So what is that? Cardiac cath lab is probably even a third of the size of this stage. It's not a big place, but if you're going to have a heart valve implanted in your chest, or you're going to have a pacemaker, or you're going to have an open heart surgery, it's going to happen in that space. So we're actually today, Medtronic, the largest cardiac cath lab. We cannot offer that service in Korea at all, because we're classified as a clinical service provider, which we're actually not. So there are certain issues of complete market closure, but the reality is we only have one of these projects here. We have multiple of them in public systems, particularly in Europe. NHS, National Health Service in the UK, very well respected from a cost and outcomes perspective, anyone would say. We're in a long-term contract at Imperial Hospital over a very long period of time. 70-page contract. I won't go into the details, but what I could just simply say, what you can also see is as we're getting out of the quarterly mode of thinking and into project management that takes change, right, within the hospital, politics doesn't always work in the same rhythm, if you get my point. You could have governments, Obrador, coming in to Mexico, who knows? You could have a change in political alignment where they simply say, all the private sector elements of that particular healthcare system, there's your door. All these type of disciplines could actually help to both explain, I think provide comfort to the public health system that the private sector does have an appropriate role, generally a supporting role to play, and at the end of the day could actually mean a better growth for American companies that excel at services and are able to produce actually better outcomes together with those health systems and also draw down costs.
Thank you, Trevor. What I struggle with, and when I was a negotiator on services, I was always trying to find the angle that might convince my counterparts that U.S. companies, what we were trying to achieve, the commitments we wanted to get from them, were beneficial to them. I was always trying to put it in a way that would be positive, as opposed to, if you don't do this, we won't let you in the WTO, right? So what I think is really helpful to U.S. negotiators is those elements that can help them overcome domestic resistance. So sometimes it's not always just, certainly cost reduction efficiency, you would think ought to win the argument, right? Or the outcomes approach, what you were talking about, Trevor, for the patient. But the reality is they're also worried about their domestic producers or the potential for their own economy to grow into those sectors. So can you help policymakers? What would you recommend they do to try and persuade foreign, negotiators to make the kind of commitments and not be so worried about their own domestic? How can you reassure them a bit? Matthew, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think on the data flow issue, the great thing is, I think we used to think of this as a technology issue. Data flows are an everybody issue. When we've talked about manufacturing today, we have some great examples from the agriculture industry where folks are using the Internet of Things to irrigate crops better. In this day and age, every business in every industry depends on these connected technologies to be competitive. And if the art of negotiation is appealing to self-interest, this is a win-win for everyone. I think we have to underscore that.
Do you, I'll turn to Sarah too and Trevor, but do you ever think of it in terms of convincing the foreign negotiators, foreign governments, the benefits it'll bring to their economy in terms of the sort of training you might provide or helping their own workers or move up the technology chain? Sarah, you want to?
That's one of the things that we talk about is when we're going into these countries, we're providing our technology services, and we're actually improving the infrastructure in country by not only leveraging and partnering with domestic partners and banks, but with making consumers' lives better and also helping the small and medium-sized enterprises, again, compete globally. So I would also echo, Matthew's statement about data flows is an everybody issue. And, in this day and age in the digital economy, I would also say that almost every company is a technology company as well. So, that notion should, have these foreign governments kind of pay more close attention to digital economy issues like data flows.
Yeah. Trevor, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think at the end of the day, as your question comes down to how do you convince the negotiator,
Yes.
I think cost is a major variable, particularly in the healthcare context.
Yeah.
The NHS actually allowed us to say after working a year with them, literally one calendar year, we were able to save them 20% off their baseline before. And that's not something you generally see in healthcare. So that tends to be fairly persuasive. But then again, I totally get the skepticism. Outcomes is very important. And what do we mean by outcomes? It means less patient going back after you've done, for example, an implant. So it means more perfection. No one wants to go back to the hospital. They never wanted to be to in the beginning. Very, very important, right? So if you can't promise one or both of those and promise them very well, then that's very important. The way I look at it, I always have this picture of this cardiologist, or it could be anybody. It could be a neurosurgeon. It could be any, that at the same time in that small space actually has to manage almost an orchestra and make sure that it works. And you never want to see a cardiologist running down the hallway at a hospital looking for a part that should have been there, right?
right,
You never want them to be like taking their eye off the ball for a second and saying, where's that patient? You know, they're 15 minutes late. Literally, this is a life-saving, often life-saving operation. So the way I kind of look at it is services help to enable mission success for doctors and patients. I know Kaiser Permanente has this nice little expression. We help doctors and nurses to return back to the practice of medical care. I have to tell you, to be honest, as I talk to actually cardiologists that are actually working with us and working with other companies, by the way, it's certainly not just ourselves. That's exactly how they explain it. We just held a presentation in public at the WHO, which, as you probably know, is not always private sector friendly. They tend to be fairly agnostic and fairly pragmatic, but you've got a lot of people all over the political spectrum from all over the world, and actually, they're all those elements can, if they play in, and you actually produce and are accountable for them, I think help. You know, at the end of the day, some skeptics will never be convinced, and that is truly life.
Tough. Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you. Sherry?
Yes. Thanks very much. Maybe just a point that could tie a lot of this together that we've heard. You asked Meg earlier, what kinds of things do we need in terms of trade policies and possibly trade agreements that would allow services to play the most efficient and best role possible in our lives and in the lives of every producer. And I think that we've heard open markets for data flows, and I completely agree with that. Lower barriers for services. The trade barriers for services are higher in almost every market in the world than those in the United States. So one of the objectives of a trade agreement is surely to get those down. So we want to have guaranteed markets for data flows. As Trevor mentioned, we don't have an agreement so far that incorporates this. We need lower barriers for services. And I think thirdly, we need to have disciplines on domestic regulation that are effective. And that ties in with what you said, Meg. So these could be their three overriding objectives in the services area. Domestic regulations, when they are divergent, impose high levels of costs. And so this is definitely not desirable. And in Asia, I think it's worth mentioning that APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Grouping, of which the U.S. is a member, will be discussing and developing this year a set of non-binding principles on domestic regulation. And this is to make sure that services regulation is applied in a transparent and trade facilitating way. And so this is an important development. The WTO members are also discussing deeper disciplines on domestic regulation, and deeper disciplines on domestic regulation are also contained in the TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement draft negotiating text. So we have different initiatives that are moving forward in these three areas. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that was really good, those three key points. I know on the data flows, we do get a lot of concern pushback on privacy, and I'm sure all your companies have dealt with that. But also, just from my own experience when I was negotiating, I had regulators sitting behind me to make sure I didn't give away any of their prerogatives to regulate U.S. banks or securities companies. So, it is a tough call, and I agree with you that you've got to get at the domestic regulation to make sure that it facilitates what's best for, both countries. But it is really tough to overcome that, prerogative of, well, we've got to protect our own people. So, that's why I've been very pleased to see that there has been a lot, at least in the financial area, a lot more cooperation in terms of, whether it's the Basel Committee working on banking regulation or some of the OECD, a lot of the work it's done to try and broaden understanding of what good domestic regulation is. But it is a real challenge to overcome that. So let me just ask specifically, Trevor, you mentioned NAFTA, and I think for the others too. That's one area that was negotiated, a few decades ago, and doesn't really address a lot of the things that we're talking about here. As the administration gets ready to start NAFTA discussions with Canada and Mexico, why don't can you just tell us a little bit, Sarah
Sure.
and Trevor, and then Matthew, if you want to add anything in terms of what you might want to look at for a NAFTA renegotiation?
I'm glad you asked. We actually submitted public comments for NAFTA. And as you know, NAFTA is quite an old agreement, so electronic payment services are not included. So we would be seeking, market access and national treatment, because national treatment gets at the domestic regulation issue for electronic payment services. As I mentioned before, our technology and infrastructure and workers are here in the U.S., so we want to maintain our ability and our cost efficiency to make sure we can export across, close borders. The other issue that we would like to see in a NAFTA is the issue of the data flows and data localization for financial services, because our customers are the banks. So in order for them to have not to be able to locate their financial data on soil would be really important. I know it was an issue that was talked about extensively in TPP. So that's one thing we'd like to see, fixed in the NAFTA, or addressed in the NAFTA, I should say.
Thank you. Trevor, go ahead.
I mean, in general, NAFTA is a relatively good agreement, but I think, Sarah, as you were saying, the medical technology industry as such did not hardly exist at the time that it was written. So all these other issues of connectivity, connected health did not exist, and so we'd be equally a proponent of those type of disciplines that Sarah and Matt had talked about, because at the end of the day, it allows remote diagnosis, sometimes remote treatment, and that type of thing. So that's one. Closer regulatory cooperation between the different authorities. Obviously, as I mentioned, we're hyper-regulated. We want to be that. That's what the public expects of us. It's part of the public trust. But I think that the three regulators can work somewhat more closely. Another thing is something called transparency and procedural fairness, which is something that usually occurs in health payment and policy area, where governments are going in and making decisions, so they can't just make a snap decision on, good morning, we are public system X, you just got a 40% price cut without understanding the basis, evidence-based way that they arrived at that decision. So that's called transparency and procedural fairness. And then finally, this issue around procurement. And as I mentioned, traditional procurement of things, fine, pretty good. But you look at life cycle costs, you look at projects that are going to extend over a longer period, you look at solutions, all of them call for a whole different potential host of issues, and we've asked for that from our negotiators to start. Yeah.
Thank you. Matt?
I just add to all the great points from my fellow panelists. A couple years back, the Congress passed an important piece of legislation around Trade Promotion Authority, and it set out some objectives which were a really terrific set of guideposts for where we'd like to see the negotiations going, and we have all indications that the administration is looking to be consistent with those objectives, but particularly around digital trade, around these issues of data flows. It was quite forward-looking and on ensuring better services market access. So looking to see those upheld. Can
I just add one
Yeah,
thing
go
that I
right
meant
ahead,
to talk
sure.
about? NAFTA will be the first kind of agreement that will be at least negotiated under this new administration. And I think, at least for our company, we're hoping that this kind of sets a precedent on, being able to modernize an agreement with these digital economy and these digital services provisions. So I think it's important to get that right.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree with that, and I think it's an opportunity sort of for across the spectrum of U.S. firms to really help. And in fact, because you're already active in both countries, right, and have shown the value, built the reputation, hopefully it's something where there can be a good example. And of course, those two countries negotiated TPP with the U.S. as well, so they were willing to make those commitments last year. So even though, of course, the Mexicans have said it's not a given that it'll be exactly what's in TPP. So there is a bit of work to do in terms of moving forward on that, but I think it is really important that our negotiators understand that broad picture, the services, the manufacturing. It's not two separate groups, and in fact, the negotiators may be a bit still an old-fashioned structure in the U.S., I'm not sure, and it's probably even more so in the other countries, especially Mexico. So that'll be a real challenge as well to get them thinking of those linkages across the different sectors and getting the negotiators to understand that what they're doing in one area has a very big impact on the other, both the give and take. So I do hope we can achieve some success there. Did you want to add something, Sherry?
I think it's important. NAFTA is an old agreement, 2 decades by now, but at the time it was negotiated, it was actually a pioneering agreement in the way that it dealt with services. from a negative list perspective, from opening all services unless otherwise specified. And it set out a model that has been used around the world for the last 20 years. And it would be nice if now it's of course out of date, and many aspects of trade have changed over time, particularly the ones we've been discussing here today. And data flows and electronic commerce and so forth, and that's not a part of NAFTA, but it would be nice if this opportunity could be grasped to make NAFTA, the NAFTA renegotiation, a second type of innovative approach to what trade agreements could look like around the world, through encompassing chapters on data flows, electronic commerce, strengthened domestic regulation, which would incorporate your transparency and procedural fairness concerns, regulatory cooperation, and expanded procurement to cover services.
Yeah, the transparency and the regulation point, I think, Trevor, you were saying that too, the surprise. And that was something that I saw many times when I was looking at financial services. People would show up at their office, and all of a sudden the government or central bank had decided to enforce a regulation that had been dormant for a long time. So the question is, can you get at that in terms of getting them to do things like, at least in many of, in the U.S., regulations don't take effect without a period of public comment. They go out on the Federal Register, private sector, public sector, think tanks, everybody's able to comment, right? Whether it's FDA, whoever it's. And then the regulator has this opportunity to go through it all and see, oh, we didn't realize there'd be this unintended consequence of this regulation, so maybe we need to work on fixing that a bit. So there's much more of that give and take to try. Of course, it used to be in the old days, it would be easy to change things after the fact, that you'd be able to go back to Congress for little fixes. That hasn't been so easy. But it is really important to get that other countries to try and use the same sort of approach, which is of benefit to their own citizens too, not just to the foreign firms that might be active in their economy. But I do want to open up the floor to questions and give all of you an opportunity to ask our real experts here. Some who've been in government, but as well are now in firms that are really trying to promote what's good for the U.S. in terms of higher paying jobs, more exports, better manufacturing, more competitiveness. Any particular questions you might have? And I'm going to start with Bob Vastine, sitting right here. Bob was the head of the Coalition of Services Industry for quite a long time, and Christine's predecessor two presidents ago. But Bob, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Meg. It's great to see you.
Oh, yeah, we've got microphones. And if everybody, when you get called on, please identify yourself.
Thank you very much. I'm Bob Vastine at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy now. And Meg, it's great to see you. We did great work in 1997 negotiating the Financial Services Protocol, the fifth protocol to the GATS. And we had a great time together, along with Wendy Cutler. But, and Sherry, I apologize for being late, but I loved your summary. I think this has been a fantastic panel. And Sherry, your summary of the takeaways, I thought was excellent. I think that Sarah's added one, and Meg, it's more than regulations that keep people out, it's regulations that keep services in. It's the data localization, not just data, but localization of services is occurring in many fields. In the oil fields in Nigeria, where they're demanding that all workers be Nigerian, no foreign technicians. So the trend to localization is maybe major and most noticeable in data, but it's occurring across the world, and it has to be added to, I think, your list of priorities. Meg, I said earlier, you were saying, how are we going to convince foreigners to be more giving, more accepting of the suggestion of the negotiating objectives that we've named, but I'm really worried that the administration isn't accepting them. How are we going to convince Ross and Lighthizer, whom I know doesn't understand services at all, that this is a really important part of his mandate? CSI at the outset was dedicated to getting the then administrations to accept services as a major negotiating objective, and I'm afraid that we're going to have to start that all over again.
How about that? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if there anyone who would like to comment on this, but basically, that's where we started, was in terms of how do we work with the new administration to put across what the key elements are. And I think each one of our panelists have already mentioned that they've submitted specifics, particularly in relation to NAFTA, but also more generally. But would anyone like to? Sherry, go ahead.
Well, I think the effort of CSI to have initiated these 3 briefing papers is already an excellent step forward. I think these are, Christine can speak to it, but I think these are serving as educational and information pieces and will be discussed this Thursday on Capitol Hill, and hopefully in future sessions and educational exchanges and informational exchanges of this kind, going forward.
No, and I just, go ahead, Matthew.
Only thing to add, during their confirmation hearings, Secretary Ross and Ambassador Lighthizer made some wonderfully encouraging comments actually on understanding the importance of digital trade and on recognizing that there were some important steps forward in the TPP negotiations on those areas, and we saw really promising signs of the potential of building on those as a foundation going forward.
And there's
Trevor,
a
go
little
ahead.
meeting going on in the White House today, I think.
Right.
That's not unrelated to the topic, Bob, but I would say that at the end of the day, what we've been doing, and a couple of the colleagues from the government are here today, in fact, is behind closed doors as we were making it starting to make the transition from a traditional manufacturing company and then more into services, starting to share our business case and our revenue uptick that's based upon that, and ability also not only to do that, but which is, key to the business case, but to be able to also say how it achieves other social benefits. We have that benefit in everything that we do has something of a social benefit. We hope it's going to be positive, and being able to show that it's American leadership as well, in a sector that actually truly is still leading around the world, at least in the medical healthcare area. Despite our 18% of GDP and frankly our less than desirable outcomes, the issue is around the world, every healthcare systems are desiring all the different inputs into the healthcare sector that America actually has. Not just technology, it's
Right.
information technology, architectural services, by the way. Huge. I founded an organization based upon that called the USA Healthcare Alliance. I chair it and I founded it, bringing together a lot of different people that had really never been together, called USAHA, into that. So it's very very apropos. But I think there's nothing short of a business case, a hard-nosed business case, talking revenue upticks, how the product flows have changed as a result of it. By the way, incidentally, we're actually procuring our competitors' products. So it's broad medical technology procurement in a way so
Right.
nothing speaks like numbers.
Right. No, and just the basic point about how important it is to our overall balance of payments position. The administration is worried about trade deficits. Well, the services surplus goes part way to offset the trade deficit. It really does show the strength of the U.S. economy, and I think as we go forward, the benefits it brings to manufacturing or agriculture or just the broad U.S. economy, I think, is something that has to be highlighted. But I'm sure all the companies will be working with members on Capitol Hill, too, because ultimately any change in these agreements or new agreements will take congressional involvement and approval. Other questions? I did see other hands go up. Yeah, in the back there, right there. Yeah, we can take the one in front. Yeah, thank you. Why don't we take a couple more questions and then the panelists can. Yeah, well, that I think is a real challenge. Kent Hughes behind him, yeah.
Thank you. Kent Hughes, Public Policy Fellow here at the Wilson Center. Terrific panel. So informative, and the three informative papers were also very, very insightful. Thank you for those. The U.S. often talks about innovation as being its secret sauce. And about 2/3 of our spending on R&D comes out of the private sector. The majority of that from manufacturing. Are we doing enough to support R&D in the services sector? And second, should we have a Department of Services as we do for agriculture?
Thank you. One more question. Yes, in the shirt there on the aisle.
James Sang, retired. Related to the first question, what does today's discussion say about the quality of the data we get, for example, from things like the Department of Commerce's survey of manufacturers and the various BEA surveys of industry? Do they really reflect what we think that these words mean now, or do they reflect an old version of those words?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. Why don't we, let's see, Matthew, do you want to start on any of those that?
Sure. I guess maybe tying on the question of in-house versus outsourced and R&D, I think those can be linked together. Actually, I think a lot of services companies are proving to be some of the greatest innovators in our economy right now. If Microsoft's research institute, MS Research, were a computer science department at a university, it would be the largest in the world. I mean, we're really proud of the innovations we're generating in that area. So I actually think the future is bright for innovation in the services sector in our economy. Actually, to geek out a little bit, if I may, on sort of productivity statistics, I mean, in the old days, the old saw was you can't measure productivity in services, or if you can, it lags behind the manufacturing sector. That's not only old news, that's not true. There's a tremendous amount of research from the OECD, from academics around the world, showing that there's a tremendous amount of dynamism and within service industries, and that service industries are actually making our economy more productive. I also want to address the question about Department of Commerce surveys. Shout out to anybody from the Bureau of Economic Analysis or other statistical agencies that's listening. We have the best trade statistical agencies in the world.
Yeah, I agree.
That said, and they're doing the very best they can with the tools that they have to show the importance of the service industries. But I think they would be the first to tell you that they'd like to deepen the questions that they asked to add a finer picture on the role that services are contributing to our economy, and they're eager to have more resources to do just that.
Thank you. Trevor?
It's not going to be a great answer, but I'll try. And specifically, Bill, I think on the issue around productivity in the services sector. Well, look at the healthcare sector. It's not terribly productive. It's very, very simple. So it's actually very, very easy for us to set metrics, and that could be us, it could be somebody else. You usually do that with a hospital or a healthcare system that are increasingly metrics-based, and you're able to truly see, given ABC interventions, how many more patients are being served. So it's actually, if all parties agree to be that accountable, it's actually really, really quite easy. And we're a heavily inefficient sector, to my point. So it's pretty easy to make a difference. And it's much more difficult, obviously, over time, right? It's much easier to find big things to change and to move around early stage, and then it gets a lot more difficult as you go on, and that's certainly so. R&D on services, I think, I can't remember who asked the question on that, but I think it's a wonderful thing. What we found out ourselves is that, even though we started actually going into Europe and introducing some of these services, and so does, by the way, some of our colleagues, like GE. I know that Siemens is moving in this direction as well. We went in basically because it was austerity. Healthcare systems were strained. 2007, 2009, had to do more, had to keep costs really at the same level, and chronic disease and illness doesn't slow down anytime soon, so they had to try to keep up with budgets particularly flat. What we found ourselves to do was that we need to look at all sorts of interesting new things from a research and development perspective. We've made investments in the services sector that we wouldn't even thought. We were a co-investor in a fund that is building tertiary healthcare in Middle East and Africa. as an example, something called the Abraj Fund, where we're co-investors with IFC and Overseas Private Investment Corporation Phillips as well. But we also realize that we're actually defining a new profession. And what I mean by that are these are the people that are sitting on the operating theaters that don't, right now they're actually trained nurses, and they're hugely proficient already at being nurses, and we're asking them to do a lot more things, which is very cool. I said to ourselves, like, guys, why don't we think of doing like an academy connected with a particular university? Because this is a discipline that actually doesn't exactly exist. Right? We're literally taking people that are doing inventory in different of our manufacturing locations and saying, oh, you do inventory over there, so why don't you go over here into, gown up, scrub in, enter into this, new world of an operating theater. Why don't you guys figure out how to do that for doctors? But the problem is that that's okay for now, but there's a limited amount of those people too. So we actually need to go in and do more research and development to open up new pathways. Very exciting, discombobulating, I might also say.
Well, that will be a challenge. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll speak to the innovation question in services. And I think, like Microsoft, Mastercard has continuously innovated in the 60 years of our existence. If you think back to how people paid for things, to think about how you pay for things today. We're investing in AI and biometrics and blockchain, all these types of new technologies that are out there today in order to stay ahead of the curve, in order to, have the best kind of security and authentication services built around your payment transactions. And then I think I can talk to you a little bit about I think someone mentioned the specialization of services, and we didn't really talk about it today, but there is, sort of a skills gap, I think, where, there's a lot of these technology jobs out there, especially in our company, and we've actually created a bunch of different programs to retrain, workers in sort of the technology skills and the business skills that we're looking for. So I think companies are also doing these types of things to kind of address that instead of outsourcing. So using our own, U.S. workers and retraining them.
Thank you. I think that's a really good example of, just looking at education more broadly. Our younger people need to learn how to learn because their entire career they're going to be adapting to these kind of changes and have to be ready to meet that and take advantage of it, right? So that they can move into increasingly higher tech, more sophisticated jobs. But that's an issue for another panel. Sherry, you wanted to add something?
Yes, maybe I'll also touch on the outsourcing question. Thank you. In the services sector, firms have been primarily outsourcing for cost reasons, but they keep their core functions at home. The R&D functions, the innovation, the management functions stay at home. So the high value components of the business operations stay close to home, and the rest tends to be outsourced in integrated production networks often around the world. This has enhanced the economic performance of services firms and other companies rather than the opposite. But to the extent that Sarah said that they can find more skilled workers at home that fill the jobs that they're looking for and want to hire, and we've all read about the large numbers of qualified tech workers that we don't have right now on the U.S. market. So to the extent we can not retrain, but train to start with, and then, of course, continuously retrain throughout one's economic career, a larger number of workers to fill the jobs that are now the kind of jobs we need for the services firms in our integrated high-tech world, then I'm sure that, these jobs will be, these skilled workers will be snapped up here at home. So I guess I would just underline the importance of skills and training. And the question about the separate Department of Services was interesting. I have gone around the world speaking to the importance of mainstreaming services into economic policy. Never really suggested the creation of a Department of Services. On one hand, I'm tempted because it would highlight the importance of services that people never think about because they don't see them, feel them, touch them, so they don't think they're there when they're everywhere. And so this would be a way of profiling services. The danger is that then we would get people to think of services in a separate category, separate from manufacturing, separate from agriculture, separate from everything, and I don't think we want to go there either. So it's a little bit of a conundrum.
Thank you. Yeah. do you
Just to
wanna-
quickly add,
Yeah.
like Mastercard, I mean, we take this skills gap very seriously.
Yeah.
It's a real issue. We have a software and systems academy for veterans who are transitioning out of military service. That's just one example of trying to hit, particularly in that middle skills area,
Yeah.
to fill those jobs and to train American workers to do them. Also, we really believe on the national level, we all need to be doing a lot more to promote STEM education in our schools. We place hundreds of volunteers around the country to do that in schools, but on a systemic level, we need policies that support that.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions in the middle here. If we can get the mic over. Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah. It's on.
Stephen Ezel from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Thank you for a great panel. It's speculated that one of the aspects of a new European map that the Trump administration may pursue is to tighten the rules of origin on manufactured products up from 63.5%. As services become a much more important input to, say, vehicles at 25%, as you said, will looking at the services contribution through rules of origin be something the Trump administration may consider?
Okay, thank you. And one more question here in the front. Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly Myman with McClarty Associates. It's been great. My question actually originally was going to be about the skills gap, but you all have addressed that. I guess what I'm wondering is, you know, how even before we get to the skills gap, we can start to educate. And Trevor, something you said is what made me think of this, that, you know, you're training people on jobs that didn't, you know, even exist however many years ago, is how can we, as a path to getting people to understand services better and to advocate for services more, better explain that, you know, what these jobs of the future might look like. So if my kids are going to have jobs that don't even exist today, and likely those are going to be services jobs, how can we explain that better in a political sense and get people less scared about that from a political sense, so that we actually are able to advocate more successfully for policies that are going to help to grow the American economy? Thanks.
Yeah, I think very good questions, both of those. That will be a tough call in terms of how to reduce the people being afraid of change or being afraid to meet the change. But let me turn to the panelists for any the sort of final comments on these two questions. Anyone want to say?
I'll
Go
take the
ahead.
education question. I think your point is right on, and you know, I think it starts honestly in the schools, in almost like elementary education. I mean, we have a program that we've started a couple years ago called Girls for Tech, and it's really based on STEM curriculum, where we're actually going to schools targeting, you know, 9 to 16-year-olds and teaching them basic STEM skills. So it should be a part of the curriculum. Just as, you know, when I went to school, you know, like banking and things like that were a part of it, and home ec were, right? We can make it part of the elementary curriculum.
Thank you. Matthew?
Yeah, similarly, I mean, we see a need for a revolution at starting at the very youngest age. We have a program called DigiGirls that's meant to get young women involved in education, in STEM education in those levels. It's really a ground-up issue. Not ignoring your question, Stephen, but
Yeah.
it's a really interesting one, but one that I frankly would need to leave to others to think through a little more deeply.
Yeah.
Focused on how we get your kids to understand what we do. And it's a great question. I mean, at the end of the day, millennials, you know, you have to focus in on that generation. You can't serve all the people all the time. Certainly, it would be relevant to others, but I think it's the social value of what it is. You know, obviously, the closer to saving lives and, you know, adding tremendous societal value, and that could be many different things, right? We'd be creating a new IT company that, you know, that gathers contributions like a foundation or something like that. But whatever it is, I mean, I think we really need to focus in on that particular aspect of it. And if it's not absolutely clear on the face of it, they'll dismiss it. And I think I agree with my colleagues who said it's got to start early. But I still think that we also need to look further, because for further even millennial and to even the elder generation to that. and explain the same things. But without that, we're going to just continue to fall behind because numbers are against us, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. Sherry?
Very quickly to the question from the IT and Innovation Foundation gentleman on rules of origin, which is a little bit technical to end our panel on, but I didn't not want to address it for you. Rules of origin, as you know, are designed for goods. They're based on the tariff classification system. Rules of origin for services have always, in trade agreements, have always been much more liberal, which is one of the huge advantages of services trade as well. They're based on the criterion of substantial business operations. So if a firm can meet that criterion in any country, in a partner country to a trade agreement, then it is considered as being an established firm within that grouping, and therefore it benefits from the provisions of that trade agreement. So if we take your question to a more logical point, the larger the services component in a product, in a given product, the more efficient, presumably, that product could be produced, and the lower cost it could have on global markets. However, to be eligible for treatment, preferential treatment in a trade agreement, if it were classified as a physical good, it would still have to meet a restrictive rules of origin requirement, and that wouldn't change no matter how high the services component went.
That's probably something that captures your products too. Well, I want to really extend a huge debt of thanks to the panelists here, to Paul Thanos for helping put this together, for Christine Bliss and the Coalition of Services Industry and the Asia program here at the Wilson Center for joining us today for this discussion. It's been very interesting, very educational, and I think the conclusion that we can tell in terms of that we can come to in terms of the policy environment, we all still have a lot more work to do. So I encourage everyone to keep services in mind as we look at trade, as we look at the domestic policy environment going forward, because it's clear from what we've all learned today that this is the U.S. economy, and we've got to make sure it remains a competitive part and can continue to do its job for the American people. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was like, wow.
Good working, you, Matt. Until next time.
I learned a lot from you today.
Yeah, the same.